Let's start the video by saying something pretty obvious. Video games are often competitive. Inevitably, if two people do a thing, they're going to want to know who is better at it. The core of this concept, after all, is why games are fun.
It's why esports turned from tiny bedroom LANs to literal stadiums built just for video games. And I love esports. I love competitive gaming. Often, watching people push a game to the absolute peak is exhilarating. It's fascinating. I don't even enjoy most MOBAs, but I'll still watch the LCS or International from time to time. I never was good at StarCraft, but I've stayed up to 4 in the morning to watch Tasteless and Artosis cast some really good matches.
Yet, for as awesome as competitive gaming can be, I wonder what impact it has across an entire community. How can the competitive scene at the top of a game affect the people that are essentially at the bottom of it? The people that aren't essentially playing at that high competitive level. Likewise, what happens when the metric for being good at a game changes over time? What happens when players push really hard against mechanics in ways that the developers never intended? What does that do to a game? What does it do to the communities around them? What happens when the metric for what makes someone good at a game completely changes? What would that even look like in practice? I don't know, but for no reason at all, let's talk about Classic WoW.
Classic WoW, if you are unaware, is a recreation of World of Warcraft as it originally launched in 2004, before the release of the game's first expansion. It's a relatively faithful recreation of the game. Essentially, it's mechanically identical, although it is on an updated version of the World of Warcraft engine. In order to recreate the environment and progression and feel of the original game the best they can, Blizzard has split it up into 6 phases. Each of these phases relates to something big, a raid tier, the inclusion of PvP battlegrounds, and so on. Currently, we're in Phase 5, which means that, with the exception of Naxxramas, all of the game's content has basically been released. Classic WoW was extraordinarily popular at launch, and it's managed to hold a lot of its popularity pretty well.
It's attracted a pretty wide audience, from people nostalgic about the game they played 16 years ago, to people that have never touched World of Warcraft before, whether that means vanilla or any version of the game.
One of the reasons why so many people were excited to play Classic WoW, though, was the promise of a challenge. Vanilla WoW was, in many people's minds, mythologized as the difficult version of World of Warcraft. Part of this is because of the time investment necessary to level up and get to 60, whereas reaching the level cap in WoW became fairly streamlined over the years. In the original version of the game, it was not that. There was also an entire mythology about the game's raids. Whereas raiding in retail WoW, as recording this Battle for Azeroth, is something that anyone can do through the looking for group system, in Classic, there are only 40 and 20-man raids, with the bulk of the raiding content taking place in 40-man raids. Likewise, raiding has changed so much over the years, and so many people remembered how difficult raiding used to be 16 years ago. When much of this content was relevant, not many people actually got to experience it, both because of difficulty and how hard it was to organize large groups of 40-man raids. Likewise, talk to any WoW veteran that has played since AQ40, and you'll get horror stories of Huhuran, Twin Imps, and Cthulhu killing raids and turning into impossible roadblocks.
So few people actually experienced the game's endgame raiding content that the difficulty of the content underwent sort of a whisper down the lane effect, where it was exaggerated over time to people and no one really knew the better for it. This led many to believe that Classic World of Warcraft was a genuinely challenging, really difficult game. And then Classic WoW launched, and people had a few realizations.
While leveling was true to form and basically how people remembered it, the 60 experience started to look different, at least in the eyes of some people. 5-man dungeons were claimed to be easier than real vanilla World of Warcraft. This was actually a pretty big deal. There were posts constantly on both the official forums and the Classic WoW subreddit saying, more or less, that these dungeons had been nerfed secretly by Blizzard, that the numbers weren't correct. People that played private servers essentially said that they felt easier, and there had to be something wrong with the game. Of course, there wasn't much proof that this was actually the case.
The first raid in the game, Molten Core, was easy, but it was never really supposed to be hard, right? Like MC isn't the peak of challenging raid content.
However, Blackwing Lair, the game's second raid, was seen to be somewhat more challenging, or at least that was the thought. When the content came out and fairly casual guilds were clearing it with only 1 or 2 wipes, some people started to worry. Of course, no one really thought that BWL was the difficult WoW content. Really, where difficult raiding began, at least in most people's minds, or at least this is kind of what I've experienced over the last decade and change talking to people about this, is Encourage, specifically the 40-man part of Encourage. That's where all of those difficult stories come from. It's what has been kind of legendarily remembered as the difficult part of WoW that killed guild after guild. Yet, when my 40-man guild completely tore through AQ40, I kinda had a sense that maybe things really weren't like that. My guild, and like I promise this isn't a flex or anything, is just we're not optimal. We're a single raid guild. We don't even bring 40 people to most of our raids. We only raid a couple hours each week. We're like the definition of what now gets called a dad guild. Like, we're a bunch of old people who just play the game, and nothing in this content was difficult. Huhuran, which when I had played the game 16 years ago was the biggest wall for my own guild, was barely a speed bump. We didn't wipe at all. I think maybe 2 people died. Twin Emps did take a few wipes, as did Cthulhu, but when I say a few, I mean it. These fights were not a challenge. They gave me as a raider about as much challenge as a looking for group boss would and the retail version of the game. I'm very hyper aware of not coming off like an elitist in this video because of the subject matter that I'm talking about here, but that's not a big achievement. On my server alone, which is a RP server nonetheless, over 100 guilds have killed Cthulhu. Back 15 years ago, that would be unheard of. I don't know if this point in the game, if you took every realm that existed in vanilla WoW, I don't think 100 guilds had killed Cthulhu. In fact, I don't even know if 10 guilds had killed them just a month and a half in.
Truthfully, this content just isn't hard anymore. I don't think that's a particularly bold statement, and there's a lot of reasons for that.
In 2004, when people were doing this content for the first time, World of Warcraft was an entirely different game. I mean, sure, the game itself might be a carbon copy, but a game isn't just the code, it's also the people that play it too. And the people that play Classic WoW today are in an entirely different place than the people that played it 16 years ago. A brand new player to WoW in 2020 is going to have a dramatically different experience compared to 2004. As I said in my video about VR chat, World of Warcraft was sort of the DMZ between the old and the new internet. It was sort of a liminal space. Vanilla WoW existed both before, during, and after the rise of YouTube. Social networks didn't exist yet. Software as a service websites that hosted guild sites and forums were created explicitly because of the difficulties many guilds faced in vanilla. Item and monster databases like Thoughtbot and Alakazam weren't accurate all the time. Class spreadsheets existed, but they weren't shared wildly, and forums that would serve as a meeting point for theorycraft didn't exist yet. Compare that to today.
There are many guides on how to do basically any boss, any encounter in the game, from multiple perspectives, regardless of what your class or role happens to be. There are plenty of class discords that have all of the information you could ever want at your fingertips. Simply by existing in a raiding guild in 2020, there's just so much information available to you that almost by default, you're better than 99.99% of the player base and 2004.
Even the best guilds in the world at the time, such as Death and Taxes, look absolutely silly compared to players today. Seriously, you can go find a video of their original Cthulhu kill, compare it to, say, even my guild's kill, and it's not even comparable. Back in retail, people were, from a technical standpoint, playing the game in a suboptimal way. They weren't wearing the right gear, they weren't in the right specs, they weren't using the right rotations, they weren't taking advantage of world buffs, they weren't stacking the right classes, and for the most part, they were looking at this content with fresh eyes and what was essentially a brand new game for the first time. Even guilds that had played in other MMOs had never quite seen raid content like this. On top of all of that, these aren't just two games separated by 16 years of time. The existence of private servers means that people have been practicing this content and polishing up their strategies for years. So to anyone paying attention, it's not surprising at all that this content is relatively easy.
But Nexramas isn't out yet. Look, yeah, I know. But even with Nexramas having a reputation for just completely destroying guilds and having some of the most difficult encounters in Classic WoW, I just can't see it providing much of a challenge for even an average guild nowadays. I think realistically the only challenge will be how big of a dungeon it is. It's going to be a time sink for a lot of guilds. Though even then, I imagine new strategies will dramatically cut down the time it takes to clear through the instance.
One of the big changes with how easy this content is that players can't really differentiate themselves from each other. Take a look around Ironforge or Stormwind, and you'll see almost every player decked out in the best gear, with epic and legendary weapons scattered around. In Vanilla WoW, having a Thunder Fury or being stacked with AQ 2.5 gear was a statement. It made you stand out. It let people know how good you were. But now, everyone does this content. Everyone looks like this. So how do you stand out? How do people know that you're better than them? While those playing on private servers might have known what was coming, the general public got a taste for the first time in November, when the EU Guild Progress posted a 25-minute and 34-second clear of Molten Core on YouTube. While this wasn't the first speedrun, or even the first time the WoW community was introduced to raid racing, it was the introduction for most of WoW Classic players to the idea of raid speedrunning. While players were trying to do things fast since the launch of the game with races to 60 and whatnot, because everyone wanted to do these things first, which has basically always been a WoW tradition, the focus soon moved from being the first to do things to the person that could do them the quickest possible.
For guilds that had been playing on private servers for years and had long since devoured and destroyed this content, they had always known that the question wasn't going to be, can you beat these encounters? It was always going to be, how fast can you do it? But now, to many Classic players, they suddenly knew what the game was going to be like. Now, it's impossible to really travel back in time and get a good understanding for what people thought that these fights were going to be when Classic WoW first launched. However, I can tell you from being there at the time that the expectation was for most average guilds that the content was going to be more difficult than it ended up being.
Like, believe me when I say there were arguments that this content would be hard, that most people would struggle with it. That was the prevailing idea, or if not the prevailing idea, at least a common enough one that these discussions would happen pretty frequently and there wouldn't be a clear winner. Like, if you're a WoW player and October of 2020, then you probably think that this is ridiculous. How could have anyone thought this content would be super challenging?
But that was the prevailing attitude at the time. People thought that Classic WoW was genuinely going to be a challenge for the average raiding guild. And yet, here we are. Now, doing this content isn't enough. It's about how fast you can do it, and the push is to go faster and faster and faster. This is the metagame for top guilds. It's not can you do it, it's how fast can you possibly do this content. The initial race doesn't really matter at all, it's only what happens after that. No longer can you see who the best guilds on your realm are just by looking at the realm forms or just looking around in Ironforge. Now it's required to go on Warcraft logs or sites similar to that and look up the times, the best times that people have completed raids in. And as an aside, there's something just really fitting about that. In 2004, games were basically closed ecosystems, the occasional form aside. But in 2020, that's just not the case.
Just as the same way that we have Wowhead for all our theory crafting needs, now there's also this other external tool to see who's got the highest progress on your realm. That used to be a task for, like I said, either just looking around and using your eyes, or alternatively going to your WoW official realm form and looking at like the progress post that was inevitably stickied at the top.
But yeah, speedrunning. All the cool kids are doing it. And the thing is, speedrunning in WoW is not like speedrunning in other games. It's really interesting.
You see, speedrunning in other games, take your pick, doesn't really matter. It's typically a solo process. It's the effort of one person learning, getting better, going back and doing it over and over and over, and posting personal bests until they can get to that level where they can challenge people that actually hold records. While there's a lot of cultural focus on things like AGDQ and similar events, the reality is unlike esports, competition in the speedrunning realm is really never ending. There's big events like the aforementioned AGDQ, but for the most part, it's really just speedrunning is going on all the time. It's constant. People are always trying to post faster and faster times. Individuals can push themselves as hard as they want to achieve whenever they want to. It's really an incredible process and kind of just a community that's unlike anyone else or any other competitive community. And while though it's a team effort, the truth is there really isn't a lot of room for individual improvement in Classic WoW. Rotations are pretty set in stone, and most are barely complicated or barely could even count as a rotation in the first place. This means that really tweaking a speedrun is up to the group as a whole, trying new strategies, getting as many people in optimal gear as possible, bringing the right raid composition. Most speedruns will bring a ton of Fury Warriors, for example, way more than the average guild will typically have access to or could even possibly gear up. That means that before their speedrun attempts, they need to actually have multiple raids going each week. It's not strange for some guilds to have 4 or 5, sometimes even more of that, individual raids going. All of those people, 200 plus people, are all essentially working together to outfit that one raid of 40 people.
Sometimes, in the case of an instance like Encourage or AQ40, they'll even have a hunter or a priest go into the raid and scout it out. They'll go through different raid IDs to find one that is good, that has good spawns of certain trash mobs. The reason for this is because if you get good spawns, your clear times will be dramatically faster and easier. This process though can take a lot of time. It can take a hunter or a priest hours to find a good raid ID, and that's a lot of investment. Once a guild is ready to approach a speedrun, they'll typically wait until a specific time to align seasonal world buffs, for example, along with regular world buffs. All of these buffs are stacked onto their specific chosen 40-man roster of the best geared people in their guild.
Oftentimes, these attempts are streamed, though not always publicly, as guilds obviously want to hide some strategies so others can't catch up to their time. For observers, this is kinda awesome. You can look through the logs to see what they were doing, what's their raid composition, what's their gear like, how fast did they kill individual bosses. It is really interesting to see how these guilds are pushing this 16-year-old game.
The thing is though, speedrunners aren't the only ones looking to these top guilds for how to play the game. These methods for playing raids faster and faster have started to trickle down to the rest of the player base, and that's had a bit of an impact.
If there is a place where players can exploit gaining experience, items, currency, or reputation, then that's precisely what players will do because they always take the path of least resistance. Since MMO content is measured in months, not hours, the content is paradoxically daunting, so any shortcut to the top will become the most popular route, even if it isn't fun. And if a game's path of least resistance isn't fun, it means the game isn't fun. Lazy or inexperienced game developers blame players for ruining a game with aberrant behavior, but these accusations are like dog owners blaming their pets for eating unhealthy scraps.
In John Statt's book on the development of World of Warcraft Classic, he gives a lot of insight into the creation of the game. It's a fascinating read. It really breaks down why the developers made a lot of the choices that they did at the time. If you're interested in WoW Classic, or Blizzard games in general, or just game development, I strongly suggest giving it a read. Regardless, in that specific quote that I just had up, Stats basically presented a typical problem that game developers face. A lot of the time, game developers, or specifically old school MMO game developers, would get upset at how players would approach their content. They didn't like the fact that players would fundamentally just break the game to do it faster or in a more efficient way, even if those things made the game less fun. Yet to Stats, this was an inevitability. Players are like water. They're going to get down into the grooves of your game and erode at it until it's broken down completely. If you let them, and honestly, even if you don't, they're going to redefine the way that your game is played. With that said, I'd like to amend his quote a little bit. For Stats, the primary driver that makes players do these kinds of things is completion. But I don't think that's the case in 2020. This makes total sense when you think about how MMOs before World of Warcraft basically operated. Just making it to the level cap was a huge achievement.
Quick confession, the only MMO I ever made it to the level cap on that wasn't WoW was Earth and Beyond, which was like the Duplo blocks version of EVE Online.
The focus on endgame wasn't as big as it is now. Nowadays, it's not just about reaching the end of the game, it's about reaching the end of the game and then showing mastery of it. I would wager to say that in most multiplayer games, the focus is not on completion, rather the focus is on really showing how much better you are than other people. It's peacocking. When you combine that attitude with something like Classic WoW, however, it does something interesting. In Classic WoW, peacocking used to basically mean getting the best gear, but now everyone has the best gear, and so that doesn't really serve as a way to differentiate yourself from your peers. So instead, we now have raid times and speedrunning. The calculus has changed. You can't show that you're better with gear, so you have to find something else. What that has turned to is showing that you know the best and most optimal way to complete these raids, even if those methods are completely unnecessary. You know, something that's genuinely funny to me is how quick all of this evolved. I can remember reading posts on the Classic WoW subreddit and the official forums, basically telling people, no, these raids are still going to be difficult enough where you're not going to be able to bring like ret paladins or boomkins or whatever. And then, for a brief moment in time, people realized that wasn't the case. You can bring these things. And then moments later, the speedrunning attitudes sort of took over, where once again, why would you want a spec like a boomkin in your raid? Are you kidding? That's gonna add 1 minute and 30 seconds to your time, and you can't have that. Like, it shifted so quickly, it blows my mind.
Back to the point here, suddenly, even so-called dad guilds like mine that are really casual and are basically filled with dads, hence the name, are gathering together every week to get world buffs, to chug consumables, to go over logs. When I poke around the forums or Reddit or even my Realms Discord, it starts to look like these are the things that everyone is interested in. I honestly believe it would be difficult, if not impossible, to find a guild that isn't at least taking a little bit of the speedrunner's playbook and applying it to their own raids. Now, at first, a lot of this behavior was chalked up to people just saving time. You know, if you can do a raid faster, then that's great. People can just blow through it and get back to whatever else it is they want to do, I guess. But I can't help but notice that in many cases, the guilds going through all this prep aren't these big towering guilds that can really take advantage of, say, something like stacking world buffs on Fury Warriors.
It's just, well, what you do now. Good guilds clear content fast, and you don't want to be a bad guild, do you? It's really interesting to me how this has infiltrated every aspect of the game. It's fundamentally changed the way that Classic WoW is played, top to bottom. And the crazy thing is, only a few guilds on a server, and realistically, sometimes not even any guilds on a server, will actually be able to realistically achieve this kind of speedrunning attitude. If you don't have a big 200-person raid guild, if you don't have all those 200 people dedicated towards a specific goal, it's gonna be challenging, if not impossible. Despite that, this meta, the competitive rules governing the top levels of play, has dripped down to even average guilds. The thing is though, you can see the same thing happening in pretty much any competitive game.
Take Overwatch, for example. The meta in Overwatch is often defined by pro players who typically figure out the best comps, which are just collections of heroes, the best plays, the best spots to play, and so on. All of these things drip down through all levels of play until the bottom 5% is trying to mirror the meta of the top 5%. Now, that makes sense on the surface. If they're playing it, it's the best, right? The thing is, a lot of what top players do only really makes sense in their hands. Likewise, at a certain level, you don't have to follow the meta exactly to win and have fun with the game. Still, no harm, no foul, right? Well, not quite. Anyone who has played a competitive game before knows that's not really the case.
Even though it's not necessary to follow the meta to a T at certain levels of gameplay, people will end up bullying those that don't. It's despite the fact that the people doing the bullying often don't really understand the meta that much themselves. Still, it's understandable. When people are losing, they're going to get mad at whatever they can point a finger at. They might not know the specific reason why they're losing, and so they're going to jump out the first person or the first thing that they can, which often ends up to the adherence to the meta. And if someone's playing an off-meta pick or doing something slightly different than the pros do, then, well, they're going to be the target of this person's rage.
The thing is though, once again, in WoW, I don't think that there's many guilds optimizing like crazy to just beat bosses. You can half-ass most of these fights with raid comps that make no sense, with no one getting world buffs and just half the people not paying attention. I know that. That's my guild. And WoW, losing used to mean not being able to kill the boss in wiping. In Classic though, the perceived losing is not that. It's just not being as fast as you could be. Winning and losing in Overwatch is a pretty binary metric, but speed, that's way more complicated and I think presents an entirely different set of challenges, both good and bad. There's always been a competitive aspect here. That's not the part that has changed. What has changed is the yardstick that players are measuring themselves by, and it's really changed so dramatically that it's entirely morphed the way that people approach the game, even if people aren't interested, consciously at least, in that particular yardstick. And that's fascinating. To be clear here, I'm not making any judgments on what is better, if gear or achievements or speedrun times, whatever. Nor am I going to cast judgment on wanting to be better than other people in a video game.
As someone that literally jumped out of my chair when I hit GM in Overwatch, I totally get it. It feels good to achieve something in a game. It feels good to feel good.
I'm also not trying to say that speedrunning is inherently bad. I think it's awesome, and I think it's really genuinely cool that guilds are breaking the game and doing things that 16 years ago people would have literally thought was impossible. Yet, there's no doubt that something changed. Classic WoW was, seemingly, set to be a relatively casual experience. By speedrunning, players have added an artificial difficulty. Now everyone has to get world buffs. Everyone has to pop expensive consumables. Strategies have changed to amplify parses. The developers didn't do this. The players did.
I think the prevalence of speedrunning in WoW is interesting for two reasons. The first is how this all relates to retail World of Warcraft in a grander game design sort of sense. I think the emergence of speedrunning is pretty predictable, if not almost inevitable. If a game doesn't let you compete with players directly, then speedrunning seems like a logical next step.
I think it's interesting that mythic dungeons in retail World of Warcraft are more or less speedrunning with added obstacles. Part of me wonders if the developers have seen this inevitability too. Like, with the kind of game World of Warcraft is there an upper limit on mechanics? Is there an upper limit on how difficult you can make a fight before the difference between failure and success is so slim that it's unfun? And maybe speedrunning is an acceptable middle ground or just an alternative to that in general. I'm not sure. I'm not a developer, but I do find it interesting. The second part here that I find cool or worth note is how it relates to what's next for Classic.
I think it's almost certain at this time that TBC Classic is probably where we're going next. It's probably what's next on the menu for Classic WoW at least. TBC was noted for having more difficult raid content throughout the entire expansion, with fights like Vash, Kill Jaden, Illidan, and basically all of Sunwell. It was a large increase in difficulty for most raiders. But despite the fact that TBC is by far my favorite expansion, I'm not delusional enough to think that these fights are genuinely going to be so challenging, or at least challenging as they used to be. Realistically, they're probably going to be speedrun right out the gate, just like Classic WoW was. But what about in a classic Wrath of the Lich King sort of scenario? What about, because so many people are going to be asking for it, a Cataclysm Classic? At what point do the speedrunning attitudes and the fighting a boss because it's difficult attitudes run into each other? What sort of tension does that create? Do they ever run into each other? Does speedrunning only pop up when this kind of thing happens? Could you argue that speedrunning already exists in retail WoW? After all, once a guild clears content, don't they try and end up doing it faster? I mean, you can argue that's the case, but I don't see many guilds comparing clear times for bleeding edge content. What does all of this mean? I don't know. I don't necessarily have a grander point to make here. I just find it really interesting how all of these things sort of come together, and how speedrunning can change the nature of an entire game. So, we've reached the end of the video. I've been careful throughout this video to not really talk too much about my own personal feelings towards speedrunning. There are a lot of reasons for that. For one, I don't want to be some arbiter that tells people that they're having fun in the wrong way, or that they're not having fun to my standards. Yet, I do think that there is a certain tension that speedrunning has caused in Classic WoW, and if I'm being honest, I do feel that it has lessened my enjoyment of the game. In fact, when I originally set out to make this video, it wasn't going to be quite about speedrunning. I was just talking about how Classic WoW had fundamentally changed from what vanilla WoW was in 2004. I ended up talking about speedrunning a lot, and so then I just cut it down to this. One of the reasons why I kept coming back is because so many of the things that make speedrunning happen, like world buffs, have changed the game so much that it really does feel like something you can escape. And that kind of sucks. I think a lot of people were expecting Classic WoW to be a really laid-back experience. It would essentially be the equivalent of going back for a nice leisurely stroll, a nice cruise through your old hometown or something. And I know that a lot of people will make the argument here that, oh, it just might be your guild, go join another guild that doesn't do these sorts of things. But like, I don't think it's realistic to say go find another guild. I think these attitudes have kind of just made their way through the entire game at this point, where they really are inescapable. Now, once again, I'm not saying that speedrunning is bad per se, I'm just saying that it fundamentally changed what Classic WoW is to me, and I think that they've changed my relationship with the game, and not necessarily in a way that's positive. I'm sure that, on the other hand, however, there's a lot of people that are enjoying Classic WoW more than ever because of this sort of discovery. The addition of a challenge to an old game that they enjoyed probably is fantastic for them. For me personally, the best way I can describe it is that Classic WoW is a lot like a cheesy action movie. When you go see a bad movie, you typically can enjoy it. You can see it 1 or 2 times and still think, oh, that was an alright time. But if you see it more than that, if you start to go at it through a deeper critical lens, you're going to start to progressively enjoy it less and less and less. The reason is simple, it just can't hold up to that level of scrutiny. It can't hold up to that level of pressure. For me, it's as simple as the developers never intended for Classic WoW to be picked apart in this way. I mean, Molten Core was developed by 2 dudes in a weekend. It's not exactly the same sort of raid content that gets developed today. I think when you put that kind of thing up to a certain level of scrutiny, it's like explaining a joke. It just sucks all the fun out of it, at least for me. But yeah, that's it. That's the video. Thank you for watching, and do all the typical YouTube things.